Today, in-person Climate Action Council members will be participating in the meeting here in Albany, with the public welcome to observe in person in Albany or via webinar to enable broader access to the meeting across the state. We will also be extending our remaining meetings to 4 hours each to accommodate what we expect to be a robust discussion as we wrap up the final scoping plan. And just a reminder that the remaining meetings will also be held here in Albany. And as approved by the Climate Action Council, there is an option for virtual participation for members with extraordinary circumstances who could not join in person today. I will now hand the meeting over to Jenny Cox from Cadmus to walk us through the procedures for today's meeting before we dive into the agenda. Jenny?
Thank you, Co-Chair Harris. So that we have another smooth and productive meeting, I will remind council members in our 2 locations of our logistics and procedures for today's meeting. We will ask the locations to remain on mute if no one is speaking, so we can limit any background noise. And I am getting an echo right now. I'm not sure if everyone is on mute. Okay, perfect. Not hearing the echo anymore. We will also monitor all locations to ensure that they are muted and remain muted. If a council member would like to speak, they can raise their hand or stand their placard on the end, and the co-chairs will make note of it. Co-chairs will call on members in order, starting in one room, then move to the other room, and call on members in order that they raise their hands. And to control the mic in front of you, press the button, and if it's on, the light on the base will be green. Also, for the benefit of the public observing via webinar, we ask that you please state your name before speaking throughout the meeting. This applies to all speakers at today's meeting. And to improve audio quality, we ask the speakers project their voice towards the microphone in front of them. As a reminder, members participating remotely must be on video and their first and last name must appear on their video conferencing screen. Thank you, and I will hand it back over to Co-Chair Harris.
Thank you, Jenny. Let's turn to identifying members of the council who are in attendance today. I will start on my left.
Co-Chair Sagos here. Good afternoon, everyone.
Henry Spletoff for Commissioner Bassett, Department of Health.
Carly Hume on behalf of Justin Driscoll, President and CEO of the New York Power Authority.
Good afternoon, Richard Ball, New York State Department of Ag and Markets.
Good afternoon, Tom Falcone, LIPA.
Good afternoon, Ian Wells on behalf of Commissioner Knight, Empire State Development.
Good afternoon, Donna DeCarolis, National Fuel.
Gavin Donahue, Independent Power Producers.
Peter Iwanowitz. Rory Christian, Public Service Commission.
Bob Howarth.
Dennis Elsenbeck with Phillips Lytle.
Ruth Ann Visnauskas, Commissioner, New York State Homes and Community Renewal.
Roberta Reardon, Commissioner, Department of Labor.
Mario Salento, New York State AFL-CIO.
Thank you, everyone. I note that we have a quorum for this meeting. And now that we've established a quorum, I'll ask any members participating virtually due to extraordinary circumstances to please state their names.
I'm Paul Shepson, and thank you for recognizing my extraordinary circumstances. Good afternoon.
Are there any other members presenting or represented virtually today? Okay, well then we will proceed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doreen. Next slide, please. Glad I brought my glasses. Okay. Our agenda, it's all there in front of you today. We'll make some quick remarks and reflections. We'll go through the scoping plan. Of course, integration analysis update with a focus on nuclear technology and get some council member feedback on the proposed edits to the plan, including the chapters of transportation, waste, local government, land use, ag and forestry, just transition, and adaptation and resilience. And then we'll get into some quick next steps. So busy day. Next slide, please. Again, just a few quick announcements, significant announcements. I'll start late last week. The Biden administration released $53 million for 132 air monitoring projects across the country, including $4 million for projects here in New York, 600,000 of which will be coming to DEC. Governor Hochul also announced a major slate of investments in clean water last week, $176 million for projects in 11 counties across the state. Dorian and I were also at the Micron announcement with Governor Hochul, President Biden, Leader Schumer, and many officials from the area, looking into a very exciting development course in central New York with $100 billion of investment and 50,000 jobs. Last week was the 10th anniversary of Superstorm Sandy. So the governor has taken the office, which is known as GOSR, Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, and pledged to create a new office, permanent office of resilient homes and communities. So it's very exciting to have GOSR become a permanent entity across New York. And I'll note tomorrow is election day, of course, turn over the ballot to look at the $4.2 billion bond act for consideration. Doreen.
Yes, last week, Governor Hochul and Majority Leader Schumer announced major semiconductor supply chain manufacturer Edwards Vacuum will build a $319 million facility in Genesee County, creating 600 jobs in Western New York at the Stamp Science and Technology Advanced Manufacturing Park. And that certainly builds on the commitment from Micron that Basil referenced as well. Specific to NYSERDA, we announced the selection of a team to design, build, and operate the state's Integrated Energy Data Resource Platform, IEDR. This platform is going to expand access to data and support new innovative business models that deliver benefits to New York energy consumers. So pleased in just 2 weeks to have so many announcements to share as well. If we turn to the next slide, certainly getting into the priority for the day, which is to discuss the path to completion of the scoping plan. And certainly, I do want to recap the very tremendous effort that this has encompassed thus far, hearkening back to the advisory panels, the integration analysis, the public comment, the subgroup work, et cetera. And here we are today to really look at the words on the paper and specifically the path to produce the final scoping plan on schedule as we have discussed. And so the discussion today is going to focus on a number of the chapters that have reflected the staff's edits to those chapters that we're here to discuss today. And that those edits are certainly based on feedback from the council, on the summaries of public comments that have been received, and the work products from the subgroups as well. I'd like to refer to that set of red lines today as version 1 red lines, because they are today the subject of council discussion. In the next meeting on November 21st, we will discuss the remaining set of version 1 red lines, which are set to be circulated to the council later this week. And really, as we look forward to the next 6 weeks, we are very focused on working through the remaining issues. I would say it is true that we are getting shorter and shorter on time. So one priority we will be having is to not bring up new issues and new items to sort of discuss and plan around, but rather really be focusing on the open issues that sit before us today as we look to produce the final scoping plan. And essentially what you can expect is based on the discussions that occur here in November and the red lines that you provide to us, my co-chair Basil Sagos and I together will produce the final direction on the language that will be part of the next version of the scoping plan. We'll call it version 2. And we would expect this to be a near final version of the plan and would discuss any final outstanding issues that members would like to make the case for during our meeting on December 5th. The following week, the version of the scoping plan that would be voted on at the December 19th meeting will be provided to council members. So what you're really expecting today is to provide input that will inform this version 2 that we will collectively be providing in the coming weeks. And we recognize, of course, that while we're striving for consensus on the elements contained in the final scoping plan, we know there will remain elements of disagreement among the members. And certainly the co-chairs on those elements will make a decision as to the approach taken in the version that's circulated to the members, that version 2, in early December. I want to remind you, this is not the end, but it is certainly the beginning. The Climate Act wisely requires we revise this plan every 5 years to ensure the strategies in the plan are updated to reflect what is a rapidly changing world in science, technology, and in general. So we'll all be coming together sooner than later to start the process of revising what we are creating today. So I just ask that you take this into account as we think about how we use our time in the coming number of meetings toward that December 19th vote. Next slide, please. And over to you, Basil.
Thanks, Doreen. You mentioned one word, consensus, and I'll just leave this slide up there for a moment. Our approach on this is to strive for consensus, recognizing that isn't always an easy thing to obtain. We will and should work of course, in good faith to find common ground as much as possible. And of course, treat each other with respect. We've shown that we as a body have been doing that now for 2.5 years. I have no doubt that that will continue. Next slide, please. So our approach to feedback, as you know, and I think we've said in the past, all your feedback received in writing or through the many small group sessions has been captured and will be addressed. So we'll spend the next 2 meetings focusing on points where we have divergent views, as Doreen has mentioned. So we'll start with the chapters of, as I mentioned in the beginning, transportation, waste, local government, land use, ag forestry, just transition, and adaptation and resilience. And we've grouped the feedback largely into 3 categories. First, topics that are best resolved through discussion by the council, so at a meeting like this one. 2, items that can be clarified through refinement of text. And then 3, items that are sort of straightforward edits will be handled directly. So you'll see as we go through the slide deck today that the feedback is organized in that manner. There are certainly major elements that have raised for our deliberation today and beyond: nuclear energy, alternative fuels, the Clean Transportation Standard, and waste combustion. Doreen.
Thank you very much. So our goal today is to get through those topics in sequence in adequate time to also leave open the agenda for general feedback that we'll certainly look to try to keep on schedule so that we can have an opportunity for specific feedback from the members outside of those number of topics that Basil just referenced. But as described, if we turn to the next slide, the first item, nuclear, certainly ties back to the modeling work that I had mentioned at the last council meeting. So our goal here is actually to hear again from Carl Maas of NYSERDA around some analysis around nuclear generation and its contributions to New York's generation mix, as well as potential opportunities that have been modeled by Carl's team. And then to discuss the feedback, both with respect to the chapters you've reviewed, as well as Carl's presentation in one cohesive set of discussion topics. So I will ask Carl to provide the updates on the integration analysis modeling work and relating specifically to the potential for nuclear energy first. Carl?
Thank you, Doreen. So as a reminder, at our last meeting, we were asked, my team was asked to pull forward some new analysis around the implications for advanced nuclear energy in our grid. And I'll provide a little bit of context first, just to do some stage setting of what's the role of nuclear power now in New York, and then give some updates on why we should give this some close looking in the sense of what are we seeing in terms of technology, in terms of some of the market interest, and then some of the federal policy. And then I'll summarize some of our analysis. So this first slide gives you an overview in the table of the installed capacity in New York that we have today and the contributions that our nuclear units made towards the energy mix last year. So in total, nuclear provided 25% of in-state generation. That's around 31 terawatt hours of zero emission power. As a reminder, our integration analysis, based on the work of our team and the feedback that we got over the year plus of work that we did, made the analytic assumption that there would be a 20-year license renewal of our existing upstate nuclear power. So that's built into all of our scenarios today. And then about a year ago, I presented some results to you all on some sensitivities, looking at the diversity of potential power sector resources. And one of those sensitivities looked at a hypothetical, if those units were to retire after their current licenses, what would it mean in terms of extra costs to the system? And it was on the order of $9 billion in order to build all the infrastructure that we would need to replace that energy that wouldn't be there. So that was a fairly narrow look at the economic impact, and we'll be looking at that again for some of the more advanced technologies. That's not the full story, of course, in terms of technical feasibility of the deployment of different resources and what diversity can bring beyond economics. But that will be the kind of narrow focus of that prior analysis and the work that I'll be summarizing today. Next slide. So I have a couple slides on some context of why this matters. So in terms of the nuclear, some of the advanced nuclear reactor technologies, what we're seeing through a number of different both federally funded and private sector activities, there are new advanced reactor technologies that are being brought forward and that offer a number of potential benefits, including greater safety features, lower waste yields, greater utilization of the field, of the fuel itself, and higher thermal efficiency, greater resilience and reliability. And then lastly, an ability to integrate into electric as well as non-electric applications. And we've highlighted that we have challenges both on the electric and on the thermal side. And, you know, as we look at the integration analysis, which reflected our Climate Act, what we saw as potential use cases were not only for zero emission electricity as it provides today, but for industrial process heat and for hydrogen production in the future. Next slide. So I wanted to give a quick state of the market. There are a number of companies, private sector companies, who are doing research right now into advanced nuclear reactors. We have some of their icons up on the slide. You know, one of the major milestones that we've seen this year is an authorized certification of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, of a new small modular reactor design. And we do see a number of other companies coming forward also seeking certification. At the federal level, US DOE has really driven this market forward with new both R&D as well as demonstrations. One example is the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, which whose awards aim at testing, licensing, and actually building of new reactors this decade. And then we've also seen a number of activity in the utility space. So from the Tennessee Valley Authority to the Utah Public Utilities, as well as Energy Northwest, which is Washington State Public Utilities. There are a number of partnerships that we're seeing right now with utilities and the private sector to deploy some of these new advanced nuclear designs. Next slide. And so to round it out, just in terms of federal landscape, we've talked about some of this in the past, but there are some pre-existing federal policies that have been looking at providing research and funding for advanced nuclear reactors. And then most recently, we have the CHIPS and Science Act, which has a number of areas in which advanced reactors would be supported. We see $800 million over 5 years for the Advanced Nuclear Technology Federal Research Development and Demonstration Program. We've seen almost $1 billion going to over 5 years to a National Nuclear University Research Infrastructure Reinvestment. We've seen hundreds of millions of dollars between this fiscal year and 2026 for the Office of Nuclear Energy, which is in DOE to carry out advanced materials R&D. And then finally, ARPA-E, which is the advanced research arm of the Department of Energy, has over $1 billion to invest in advanced nuclear research, or it's advanced research projects, which could have nuclear as part of its aspects. And then finally, which we've spoken out already, is the Inflation Reduction Act. And there are a number of incentives there across multiple technologies. The focus of the analysis that we've looked at up until this date and we'll be looking at for the forward-looking scenario are the tax credits for production and investment for advanced nuclear reactors, which are new, and with certain adders for prevailing wage and domestic content and construction in former energy communities. There's over $100 million, again, to the Office of Nuclear Energy, and that's to including advanced reactor projects. There is $700 million looking at research into new fuels, as well as development and use of advanced reactors. And then finally, in the loan programs, and there are several of them, there are billions of dollars that are potentially available for nuclear investments in the U.S. So there's, we've had a long history of supporting nuclear energy at the federal level, but we've certainly seen a substantial ramp up in these past years. So next slide. So with that was the background and some of the context of why it seems like it would be appropriate for us to take a fresh look at nuclear energy through a new sensitivity. So our team did some analysis, and what we wanted to explore was how introducing the new nuclear potential technology costs, as well as the new IRA provisions, how they could impact what our capacity build would be in the electric system and therefore overall system costs. So we recognize there's considerable uncertainty in what those future installed costs will be for nuclear energy. So we did a low and a high technology bank. That high bank, which is that top line, reflects what is understood to be the current pathway for nuclear energy. So not looking at some of the new advanced small modular reactors, which hold great promise for significant cost decline, where part of the premise is you have smaller reactors, you can do greater economy of and economy of scale by having more units. So there's learning by doing. So that lower line represents some of the forecasts for what the lower cost nuclear energy could be with these small modular reactors. We did a screening analysis in the time we had. So we did several simplifying assumptions. We looked at new builds upstate. We looked at 90% factor of the utilization, which represents how nuclear reactors are run today. We recognize there may be more flexibility in some of these new technologies, so they could have higher turn down. And then we looked at the availability of the IRA credits through the entire study period due to the Safe Harbor acts, part of the acts. So those are the key framing assumptions in this analysis. Next slide gives you what we found. So just to orient you to these graphs, they are stacked bars of our installed capacity, so megawatts in the system, looking at 2030, 2040, and 2050. The bars on the left represent the scenario where we had a high cost nuclear, and the bars on the right included our low cost. In both cases, we included the IRA provisions. So what did we find? Under a high cost nuclear sensitivity, there was no new nuclear capacity added. So those are those bars on the left. The only amount of nuclear that's in there is those that were able to be relicensed. What we did find, though, in the low cost nuclear sensitivity is that 4 gigawatts of new capacity were added by 2050. So if you remember back to that earlier slide, we have a little over 3 gigawatts of installed capacity today. So that represents more than a doubling of that could possibly be seen if we could see a low-cost nuclear scenario with these IRA incentives layered on. What I hope is clear from the figure, though, is that from both scenarios, a majority of the energy and the installed capacity is from wind and solar in 2050. So we're still seeing tens of gigawatts of solar and wind, and they're providing a substantial share of the energy. But what we are seeing is that there's a possibility through low-cost new advanced designs and the IRA that we could see more capacity. And what change in the system do we see with that higher capacity of nuclear? We see that it would displace in the near term over 10 gigawatts of intermittent resources, as well as 5 gigawatts of firm resources and battery storage. So what it shows you is the capability that these reactors provide they can provide multiple services to the grid, and in so doing, displace multiple types of technologies. And as I said, it's a little over a doubling of the amount of energy. So while I mentioned earlier is 31 terawatt hours of current energy from the most recent year, this would be 33 terawatt hours of new additional nuclear energy in the system by 2050. Okay, so last slide. Next one, please. So these kind of key takeaways. So what we found from the analysis is that the availability of both the IRA and the lower cost advanced nuclear reactors are essential for the potential economic competitiveness of nuclear energy. Under the IRA and with low nuclear costs, adding new nuclear capacity and displacing renewables and firm generation would reduce electricity system costs by over $1 billion. And that's why they're added to the system through our least cost economic models, because with these low cost nuclear and with the IRA subsidies, we would be saving the system over $1 billion with this new technology. We do want to recognize that transmission costs and lack of operational ability may have limited that 4 gigawatts. So really, this is a first look at what might be called a screening analysis. And we could hypothesize that with more flexible new reactor designs, we might see nuclear playing a larger role. We could see with different assumptions around transmission, if more transmission gets built for the whole system than what we modeled, you could see more energy flowing from upstate to downstate, and that could put additional economic value on upstate nuclear. And then the last note is, while these resources may be less land intensive, which is certainly the case for a lot of our intermittent resources, there's still significant construction and permitting challenges that remain. And so we want to be clear is this is an economic sensitivity analysis. This is not a policy statement. We wanted to do, what we were asked to do is a what if scenario around the economics and to share that with you all to help inform your deliberations going forward. So that's it from me. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Carl. I do want to note, I believe Ann Reynolds has joined us as a remote virtual attendee. Ann, are you on?
I am, yes.
Okay, thank you, Ann. If you could, oh, there you are. Okay, perfect. Oh, and Keisha Santiago has joined in person. Keisha. So I think we could certainly open this up for any feedback or discussion, noting in the room, I think I saw Tom Falcone first on the list.
Just a question, actually, Carl. I mean, and it may be this is a very high level screening analysis, you may not know, but if you're doing this analysis, those new nuclear, if they happen, if costs are what are projected, we don't know that. But I would assume those are towards the back end of the build out, 2035, 2040. When do they come online?
Yeah, that's correct. If we go back a couple of slides, actually, it's a little bit hard to see. So I'll, just because they're a small piece of the overall pie. But they do come on in the back years. So we're looking at 2040 and 2050.
Okay, so what I take from that is we have plenty of time to sit back and make a decision later based on what happens.
Correct, right. Yeah, I think this just reinforces the benefits of a more flexible policy framework that can adapt over time.
Thanks, Tom. Bob?
Thank you, Carl. I think that's a great summary. It seems fairly done. I have two questions. One, on one of your earlier slides, you said that there's if the current nuclear plants were to be retired earlier, there'd be a $9 billion extra cost. Can you put that in the context? I know there are subsidies for those existing plants, right? So that presumably that $9 billion cost includes those subsidies or not? And if you could just give us some sense of what the subsidy costs there. That's one question. The other is you're assuming a 90% capacity factor, and that seemed like it might be a little high to me, but you actually said you thought it might be conservative. So my understanding, at least in the European context right now, is that the average fleet there is down closer to 72, 74% capacity factor over the last year or so.
Yeah, no, great questions, Bob. Thank you. So on the capacity factor, what we've seen is since deregulation, we saw a substantial uptick in the utilization and the capacity factor of our nuclear fleet. So with those market signals and that incentive to run more, we have seen 90+ capacity factors of our units in the field. I guess maybe what might be counterintuitive is that a lower capacity factor could actually reflect more flexibility that some of these new systems may have, where they have built-in storage. There are some new units, for example, that will use some of the molten salt in order to store thermally some of the energy, allows them to ramp up and down more. So a lower capacity factor could actually reflect in the future the fact that we're getting more actual value from those future units. Right now, they're just, turn them on and run them. And so they're trying to maximize their overall runtime. So that is what we're seeing today. In terms of the relicensing and that cost, what we looked at was beyond the current licenses, which go out several years. So it would be if they could go for another 20 years, or in this case, if they were not to go forward in that sensitivity for an additional 20 years, what new technologies and resources would we have to bring on to replace them? And that was that $9 billion. I would have to say, I'd have to get back to you on the total, estimate subsidy. That will evolve over time depending on what the market price is. So we'd have to take a look and see kind of what the current subsidy levels are, what a new forecast would be. With higher natural gas prices, we might need lower subsidies for them. So that's a dynamic answer.
And Dennis? Dennis, could you just use the mic?
Oh, I'm sorry. We made an announcement this morning about companies that we've attracted to New York. Those type of companies are, and we make mention that those companies are aligned with our renewable energy strategy, which is fantastic. But those type of companies also rely on consistent power, perfect sine waves, and power quality. So some of this, Carl, when we say we have time, I don't think we have time. I think there's a lot of education that has to occur. And I think we ought to think about what is the tolerance of intermittency as we go forward, especially with these type of companies. Any energy intensive company is looking at this a lot different than we are. Those operations tend to be 24/7. So we may think that grid level storage will ride us through. I don't happen to be one of those people. I think we got to think about this from an intermittency point of view and strength of the system. I like the smaller modular systems. Unfortunately, I've been in this industry so long that I went through the 9 Mile one and others, and they were built custom. So a lot of the newer technology is almost what they refer to as off the shelf, Carl, more standardized versions of the smaller systems. So I'm really in favor of looking at nuclear. I think we need to think about this sooner rather than later, because there's going to be research dollars available, and I'd like to start seeing our university system capture those research dollars, especially our flagship universities. We should be leading this conversation to determine how they fit within the framework of our strategy for climate change. So part of this also then is, Carl, do we need to include throughout the document that if we go down this path, that we are in favor of renewables and other carbon-free technologies, or do we feel we've captured that?
Yeah, so I think you'll have the opportunity with the electricity chapter red line to be able to make sure that those perspectives are advocated for. Yeah.
Okay. Rory?
Thank you, Chair. Carl, I have a question that piggybacks off of a question earlier, and it relates to the timeline for development. Now, I know you mentioned that these projects would come online in later years, but what do you view as the timeline from the proposal to implementation of and production of power for one of these plants? That's the first question. And then the second, just looking at the analysis, to what degree did transmission costs and transmission needs play into driving the $9 billion replacement cost and potentially the feasibility of these new locations?
Great. Yeah. So our capacity expansion model does co-optimize between generation, transmission, and storage. So it has an ability at a zonal level to look at if we could build more transmission with the assumed costs to bring more power, for example, upstate to downstate, what would be that overall build? So transmission was certainly a part of the equation. It's not a dominant part of that $9 billion of avoided costs. And I would also say that, as we did for the power grid study, we would, to really answer the question of congestion value and the true value of more transmission, we would need to iterate in the future through future iterations of this analysis, working with the ISO, looking at multiple types of models. So using our capacity expansion platform, but then looking at production cost modeling, which will give a better sense of what the value of transmission is. And so I think that's going to be a really careful and important collaboration with the ISO to really bring out some of those values. In terms of timeline, I think we're looking at least a decade for when these types of projects can kind of get up and going. And to be frank, the real answer is we don't know yet, right? Because some of these new modular reactors are only now just being authorized. There's one that's going to be built on a national lab site, and that's because permitting was significantly easier on that site. So I think, most of the literature you can look at, it's a decadal long process, but we don't really have the answers yet because we don't have any of these new modular reactors built.
Gavin?
Thanks, Doreen. First of all, Carl, thank you for your message today. One of the things that I've been harping on throughout this process is that the state be flexible. We be innovative. We try to promote new technology, regardless of what that technology is, because we really don't know what technology is going to apply 25 years from now. And I think that this presentation shows that we got to keep the door open in New York State. One of the things that, just to pick up on Commissioner Reardon and Mario's comments, we don't talk about jobs. There's a tremendous amount of jobs associated with these types of nuclear reactors. And I think that's really important for New York State. And the other side of it is the tax issue. And if we can keep the door open to private companies to want to invest in New York State, I think it's a really, really good message that this council can send. And I give Carl and the council credit for coming up with this presentation. Because I'm a big believer in this, and I hope that this moves forward in this process. So thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. Last card up here in the room is Peter, and I believe we have Paul online as well.
Great. Thank you, Doreen. Peter Iwanowitz, for those following along online. Carl, your first slide that you had out there, you said that it would be 31 gigawatts, I guess, of zero emissions electricity. What was the metric you used to define zero emissions?
Yeah, so that was 31 terawatt hours, but you got the right number. So that's based on zero carbon emissions. So zero greenhouse gas emissions coming from that facility. And that's the same premise of our zero emission credit program that we have running today.
Okay, so you didn't look at co-pollutants or anything like that. You just drew the line at carbon.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Paul Shepson?
Thank you. Carl, thanks for the presentation and information you provided. It really helps with nuclear context. First, a quick comment that in the same way that we have never incorporated the environmental costs into carbon-based fuels, I'm wondering about the costing for advanced nuclear. Do the cost estimates incorporate the costs of disposal of spent fuel or any high-level waste? And if not, how would it change the cost estimates if we included the costs of disposal and remediation at the end of life?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So yeah, I'll have to unpack all those assumptions, but I do believe that those costs include end-of-life decommissioning costs. And at this point, we don't have a central spot to go ship it to. So that would mean that any waste would have to remain as it does for current nuclear fleets. So there is an end of life assumption in terms of cost.
I'm sorry. There's an end of life assumption that high-level radioactive waste would be handled in the way that it is now, which means no plan whatsoever.
Meaning storing in place. Yes.
Storing in place indefinitely in the absence of an actual national plan for how we manage our spent fuel waste.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I think that ends the questions. However, I had promised that we would also, as part of this discussion, bring up any points anyone would want to raise with respect to the sort of the language in the chapters you've reviewed, specifically within the Just Transition chapter, for which there was some feedback around the language that was used around advanced nuclear technologies. So if there were any other comments from the members around the framing of this technology in the context of the Just Transition chapter, we'd welcome that as well. Bob?
Thank you, Doreen. Just briefly, I raised some objections in our call the other day on that, but it was in the context of, we haven't seen the rewrite of the power chapter yet, right? And it seemed to me inappropriate to suddenly drop nuclear into our plan for the first time in the Just Transition chapter before we had heard Carl's presentation today. So I think we should think about how we present it as we move forward, but I'm less concerned now than I was a few days ago.
Thank you. That's helpful, and we'll remember to double back on this when we review the electricity chapter, as well as Carl had indicated. Okay, then I think with that, I will hand it over to my co-chair.
Thanks, Doreen. So if you, next slide, please. I will take up council thoughts on potential edits to the draft scoping plan, and to kick things off, Maureen Letty, can you handle alternative fuels?
Thank you. Thanks so much. The members provided some very helpful feedback on the treatment of alternative fuels in the chapters that we reviewed. And we wanted to take a moment here to acknowledge that feedback and further discuss. So there was a need to better clarify, as the alternative fuels subgroup had created somewhat of a prioritization around capturing biogas and using that energy, with the first preference being using that biogas in its unadulterated state or its raw state on site, where that's feasible and practical, before refining it into RNG, again for on-site use prioritized, and local uses for the excess renewable gas that is created at those sites. So we'll definitely make sure that is very clear in those plan chapters. There was also discussion around language around infrastructure build for this. We were looking at, this is the waste and agriculture chapter. So this is places where we are capturing methane as a source. So at a farm-based digester, a water resource recovery facility, or a landfill. And the reference to the infrastructure was meant to be more narrowly focused on infrastructure build at those individual facilities, not applicable broadly to the gas system. And also there was a concern around the term significant having open to interpretation, depending upon your point of view. So I'd like to suggest we could align that language to be clearer around the investments in infrastructure are designed in a way that they are not creating a continued reliance on gas or getting in the way of the needed pace of electrification that is envisioned in the plan strategies. And then just to generally make sure that that language is very clear and consistent between the two chapters. Then there was specific questions on the biomass action plan recommendation in the agriculture and forestry chapter. It wasn't clear in that recommendation that the biomass action plan and looking at fuels is not as a substitute for electrification, but really only where those fuels can fit into the bigger picture to help advance the electrification that we need to have happen in order to achieve the emission limits. So that language needs to be added, that needs to be reinforced, that as this plan envisions these fuels, it is not as a substitute for the needed electrification, but only to serve to help more efficiently electrify. And that where there are sequestration benefits from using biomass in this matter should be more clearly defined. And the group was looking more at these opportunities where having a market for low-grade wood or forest residues helps incent better forest management practices. So you manage forests for more carbon sequestration by creating a value for those products that when taken out encourage more tree growth and more sequestration. So that should be clearer in that portion. So that's the summary of the topics we discussed. And I'm happy to further clarify any additional questions or open up a discussion of the members on this topic.
Are there any questions, Maureen? Bob?
Yep, more of a comment than a question. Thank you, Maureen. I think this is it's very helpful and certainly addresses a lot of the issues that I had been raising the other day. The only thing I would add, and it's not a criticism of what you've said, but I think it's important in the report to clearly state what biogas is and what RNG is, because I find a lot of people just don't know the difference. And for those of you who don't think about it a lot, biogas is the mixture of methane and carbon dioxide and other gases which comes from anaerobic digesters and comes from landfills, and it can be used directly for lots of uses. RNG requires a further refining process, which takes additional energy. So it ends up with higher carbon dioxide emissions, less energy use, and it also results in far higher methane emissions. And so I've argued, well, for a better part of a year that biogas should be the way to go whenever possible. And there are places where the refining is useful. I agree with that. And so for RNG, but I think we should just be really clear on what those differences are, because a lot of people treat biogas and RNG as synonyms, which they are not. So thank you.
Donna?
Thank you. Thanks, Maureen. I just wanted to, I guess, ask you, or maybe just flag that I think what we also talked about is just, the ability to use biogas or RNG in difficult to electrify strategic uses. So, I think I don't know if it's in here, but maybe I just want to kind of ask you if that's true, and maybe we just kind of talk about that a little bit. And then the other thing I would just encourage us to consider, and I think we talked about this during the 4 months when we had the alternative fuel subgroup meetings, is sometimes there's nothing happening with the, the emissions. They're just going to atmosphere. The methane's going to atmosphere, and there's nothing being done to try to help capture them. And I think to think about this as an opportunity for investment and for a way to help the state decarbonize through capturing, biogas or converting it to RNG and doing it in a way with RNG, and we talked about this a lot too, it can be done well, it can be done with minimized leakage with regulation. And let's just at least consider it as an option for decarbonizing. And I think we talked about this too. Other states are doing, whether it be a renewable gas standard, a low carbon fuel standard, to provide an incentive for folks to invest in getting this methane captured and reducing emissions that would otherwise just be, maybe nothing would be done with it. Yes, if it could be used locally on site, that's great, but maybe nothing would be done with it. So rather than having, manure lagoons, let's come up with some options for people to invest. So anyway, sorry, I had a question, and then thank you for the comment.
Nope, that's right. The alternative fuels subgroup did say that the limited supply of RNG should be targeted to strategic uses and challenging to electrify applications. So we can make sure that's also clear in the language as well.
Thank you, Donna. Peter?
Yeah, thanks, appreciate it. Peter Iwanowitz. Maureen, thanks for the nice write-up. I mean, just to Donna's point there at the end, and I think you just clarified it, but I think everybody in the working group and elsewhere agrees that we have to capture this waste stream. And if we, it's not done in a way that sort of, meets that bullet number one, we'll have to regulate it. It's not going to be a source of emissions that we can abide by any further. So I really think that that first bullet really clarifies that. And the strong preference is to use it locally on site without combustion, as we've talked about, is really just an important feature of capturing these waste gases so that they aren't part of our greenhouse gas inventory going forward.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Any other questions, comments? Okay. Thank you, Maureen. Maureen.
Okay, if we turn to the next slide, the next subject that we had wanted to discuss in detail is the Clean Transportation Standard. Jared Snyder with DEC is here to sort of summarize the items we were hoping to discuss, and he's joined by Adam Reuter of NYSERDA as well. Adam is starting. Jared is clear on that. Adam.
Thank you for having me this afternoon. So we've, as you're aware, we've discussed this topic a few times, sometimes under the name Clean Fuel Standard. For those who have had a chance to review the revisions to the scoping plan, we've rechristened this Clean Transportation Standard in part to differentiate what we're proposing from some other clean fuel standards or low carbon fuel standards in other jurisdictions across the country. And so that really, I think, gets at this first point, question about how this is different and whether it's more narrow in terms of allowable options than a clean fuel standard. And the point that we're really trying to drive home here is that while this certainly could look, there are a lot of similarities, it would preclude the participation of fuels with higher co-pollutant emissions than the fuels being replaced. This is of really critical importance to meeting the Climate Act goals and has been driven home by the Climate Justice Working Group in a number of discussions. In addition, as the target carbon intensity declines over time, getting closer to zero as we approach 2050, fewer alternative fuels would generate credits in this system. Not that they would be banned from the state, but they would not generate credits under this type of system. So it doesn't necessarily, have a more restricted list of fuels, but there may be a more restricted list of fuels that would generate beneficial credits. We also heard the feedback to include a clear direction to advance the policy if the analysis of viability, need for, and efficacy supports the policy and the elements of design mentioned above are incorporated. This, I think, ties back potentially to this fourth bullet on suggesting using could instead of will or would in the write-up here. I think in the write-up in the draft scoping plan, we tried to make it clear that the first step is doing this analysis and doing a more rigorous analysis of what this could mean, what the impacts are, and how this could relate to other elements in the scoping plan, particularly in the economy-wide discussion. And then if that analysis passes muster and this is determined to be a beneficial policy that would help us achieve our goals at a reasonable cost, then we would move forward. I think with with the question about using could or will versus will or would, happy to get feedback from the council here. Peter, I think that was your comment last time we spoke. If you have any more to add on that, I think the first comment that I was referencing was Ann's. So I'd be happy to hear from both of you again. And then just a related, somewhat related question was about a caveat that we had written in about whether we have organizational capacity given other policies. And noting the comment noted that we don't necessarily make that distinction when discussing some other policies. In this case, we felt like it was relevant because we did want to recognize the amount of staff time and resources that would be committed to developing both an economy-wide program and a clean transportation standard. So as part of the analysis when looking at a clean transportation standard, we wanted to make sure that the value added from a clean transportation standard justified that commitment of resources. So if there are further comments on either of these, either clarifying or further questions, I'd be happy to discuss further.
Thanks, Adam. Happy to start here in the room, except for I noticed you noted Ann Reynolds, maybe Ann online. Do you have anything to add, Ann?
Not really a question. Just appreciate that this information was put up on this slide. I think at least 2 out of the 4 were mine. One of the suggestions I made was stylistic, which was there is a paragraph in there that talks about how this standard would be different from a low carbon fuel standard in other places, and that's the result of lots of discussion. So I was just suggesting that that be highlighted into a list of here's the different elements of design that we're talking about. I also think, one of my comments was that I'd like to see it be a little bit more assertive, like we'll do this, and it's not saying we'll have it, but we're saying we'll do this analysis about the need and efficacy and viability, and then based on that analysis, we'll start a rulemaking. So I think the will is still caveated on that analysis. And I think my personal opinion is that also covers the issue of organizational capacity, although it's not something I'll die on the sword for at all, because I understand why it's written there. But it's really under need, like we're going to need, I think, resources to implement the other parts of the transportation plan. But if that turns out not to be true, like we have the resources for all the carrots, all the incentive programs, because we have an economy-wide pricing mechanism, then, we wouldn't have to do this. I think it should be based on that need rather than the organizational capacity. And I just think that could be written about 5,000 times through the whole plan. But I respect that this is somewhat unique in that these are would be overlapping policies. And so I think that's captured in the viability, the need for, and the efficacy of a transportation standard that's designed with those listed elements. But just explaining my comments there, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ann. Peter?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Peter Arwanowitz again. Thanks for the walkthrough, and these slides are certainly helpful. I guess my point is you mentioned step 1, and I guess when I'm raising the issue of coulds, wills, or woulds, it's let's get not put the cart before the horse on other fuels. I think it's pretty straightforward when we're talking about renewable electricity that has no carbon emissions associated with it. That's probably a straightforward pathway. The analysis on the other fuels really needs to take into account a lot of different factors. So my belief is rather than sort of presuppose that analysis, that we should take our time and say, if it does, we could go down this pathway. I don't think it needs to be a fait accompli that we're going to move down that pathway. The other concern I have here, and I think we should do the same thing that we just did with the discussion on advanced nuclear, is to move this into the discussion on economy-wide strategies on November 21st. We haven't really gotten the input of the Climate Justice Working Group on this piece of carbon pricing. I know that there was a little bit of discussion during last Thursday's meeting with them on economy-wide, but I think we really should be talking to our subject matter experts, on this piece very directly. They had some pointed comments in their general overview of our plan, but we really haven't had that robust dialogue with them on economy-wide strategies, of which the clean fuel standard was a piece of it. So we definitely need to really make sure that when you move away from clean electricity being a fuel we want to sort of use and incentivize, that we have to live up to that promise of making sure that these strategies on transportation are equally not aggressive, and they're not going to lead to pollution hotspots. I mean, I think our draft chapter on economy-wide solutions does indicate that it's hard to develop these programs without them being regressive, and also how do you preclude pollution hotspots. So those are going to be really two key pieces of step one, and I just don't want us to put the cart before the horse on all those things. You asked for some additional feedback. I gave you additional feedback.
Thank you, Peter. Dennis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I know some of this and most of it will be covered in the electric section, but when I read these section and it's almost in a siloed point of view, it comes across that we're focused on charging stations, fueling stations, all the end use, even directing the Public Service Commission to create utility rates to inspire the use of vehicles. I just think we need to make sure that we're pointing to the lack of distribution. So if we're doing studies, regardless of the size of the vehicle, I think these studies have to include the distribution network. And if that's just assumed, because I'll say the same thing in the electric section, I'm good with that. I just think this almost is Pollyanna, saying that we're going to install these and think we have the infrastructure in place in order to accommodate. So I don't know if that makes sense at this time or wait for the electric section.
We certainly recognize that is a major challenge for getting charging stations built, and there are locations in the state where you could build a whole bunch of charging stations, and then locations where even just building one is gonna be a strain, and certainly that's recognized. That wasn't the main focus of the transportation section, obviously, but in the analysis that's gone into this throughout, we have tried to factor that into the cost and our ability to meet some of these needs, understanding that it is going to require a lot of new investment over the coming decades.
Kevin?
Just briefly, I go back to the beginning about the purpose why we're all here is to obviously lower carbon intensity in New York. And where I found myself in this language is that we should make sure whatever language we have is the technology is performance-based. Like, we shouldn't decide what a clean fuel standard is and pick out that technology today. We should give DEC the latitude to move forward, I think, to keep all options on the table as a way to reduce carbon emissions in the transportation sector. So I think it's really important that we don't have statements in there about banning certain technologies before we know exactly what those technologies are and how they comply with Section 7 in New York State's regulatory framework. So for me, it should be performance-based and not technology-based. And I think you've come a long way in this language, and I appreciate the work out of it. So, thank you.
Okay. No other questions or comments on this? Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Adam, Jared. We now have Dareth Glantz from DEC who will talk about the waste combustion section. Dareth, I think, is on our Zoom link.
Yes, I'm on virtual.
Okay,
Hello?
Dareth,
Yep.
thank you.
No, right here. And so with the waste combustion, I know that was a big topic of conversation. And so in the waste chapter, the vision is for 2050. It's noted that the existing capacity for combustion of municipal solid waste is retained to manage some waste. And so the main goal is to reduce waste by 85%, so we can reduce methane emissions coming from landfills, and recognizing that there's a residual as a result of any kind of processing. And some of those residuals can be used again, and some of them will have to be isolated forever in a landfill, and some of them can be combusted with high environmental controls. And so after reducing waste by 85% in 2050, we know that there's going to be some waste that we're still going to have to deal with in order to make sure that we're protecting public health and the environment that cannot be recycled or reused or composted. So there's a need to clarify that chapter of what high environmental standards mean. And there's a continued operation of combustors should be discussed in the context of the facilities meeting all permitting requirements, including the requirements of Section 7 of the Climate Act, examining the consistency in statewide greenhouse gas emission limits and disproportionate burden on disadvantaged communities. And the waste chapter defers to the Public Service Commission in determining if electricity generation from municipal solid waste combustion will continue after 2040. I think that's the only piece. So is there more discussion?
Any questions for Dareth or comments in the room? Bob?
Yeah, thank you for that presentation and for this update. Waste management's a huge challenge. I understand that. But it seems to me we want to be pushing as hard as we can in the state to improve where we've been in the past. And I wonder if we want to, going to your second bullet on after reducing waste by 85%, I mean, that's a target, but absent advances in technology, I think we ought to be doing every creative thing we can to advance those technologies and reduce that even further. We had some discussion on this in the small group the other day, and in response to that, I got a surprising amount of email from various people who weren't part of that, so I'm not quite sure what that's about. But one of the consistent suggestions I received was that we require the DEC to, every 5 years or even more often, come up with a new look at the waste management in light of the CLCPA and our overall targets. And I think I would support doing that. I'm not sure 85% by 2050 is sufficient. So I'd like to see more emphasis on doing even better. So,
Yeah,
I do know it's a huge challenge. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. The DEC regularly updates the vision. I think it is very much guided by the CLCPA. I think the scoping plan is speaks, we're very much influenced by it. You'll see an updated solid waste management plan for discussion. Many of the recommendations that you got from the waste panel detail how we would get there. We do know there's a residual that we're gonna have to manage and isolate. I've been looking at the numbers as far as our waste diversion and recycling rates, and we have a long way to go. We really think that there's a plan in place to be able to achieve 85%. And we're always, we'd like to exceed those expectations if at all possible with other technologies that are out there and behaviors and practices, and recognizing the importance of infrastructure for sustainable solid waste management as well. It's got to be easy, and there's got to be markets, and we need to support those secondary materials. We need to make sure producers are part of the solution. It cannot be externalized solely to municipalities and taxpayers and individual residents. It's too far down the waste stream. So I agree with you. There's a lot of work to do and a lot of opportunity. And it being the 4th largest contributor to the state's greenhouse gas emissions, and we can do so many of these changes right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Any other thoughts? Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Basil. It's Peter Arwana once again. I don't think it's a correct read of the law that says that the PSC will be the one determining if electricity generation from municipal solid waste will continue after 2040. I think the emission standards and the permits and the renewals of permits falls squarely within DEC's purview. And I think that has to be, firmly considered there. It might be a mix of the last two bullets on this slide, but I really think we should be not making this broad assumption that the emission standards will be determined by the PSC. We've got an environmental agency, there's permit renewals that they have to go through. DEC will have to obviously screen all their decisions as it relates to emissions standards for incinerators with section 7.2 and 7.3. So I don't think it's a correct read to sort of say that we should defer the PSC in determining. No offense, Rory.
So I want to make sure that I clarify this. I think it's really, these words really matter, right? So it's if electricity generation will continue after 2040. So the DEC, continues to have rigorous standards as far as air emissions monitoring that would not be ceded to the Public Service Commission, but it's whether or not that material is those electrons are being put onto the grid. That would be in the Public Service.
Yeah, and I guess
review.
Sorry.
Mhm.
And I guess my point, Darius, is you can't separate a discussion on whether we'll generate electricity from municipal solid waste and how that sort of relates to the zero emission standard that's in law. They are intertwined and they can't be separated.
Okay, thank you.
And I just want to note for everybody here, we had a good discussion with the staff last week about this issue. And, right now, 6 out of the 10 garbage burning plants that exist in New York are in disadvantaged communities. An additional plant is in an EJ community. And I think that's part and parcel of this whole discussion about how we ensure climate justice and environmental justice as we move ahead with all aspects of the plan. And this being a very, very big piece for a number of communities in New York.
Mhm.
Okay. I think that does it. Dara, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Doreen.
Yes, thank you, Dareth, and everyone for digging into the topics that the staff and the co-chairs had identified as those that sort of persisted throughout the comments that we'd received on the chapters we're discussing today. Certainly do have a window of time in which I'd like to open it up for any other general feedback from the members, knowing that we certainly didn't cover every topic and sort of knowing the hierarchy of comments that we described at the beginning, some of which really are more edits that our teams can be making on their own. I'd be interested if folks have other topics they'd like to raise for the purposes of discussion now. So we do have a good bit of time that I think would afford such an opportunity, and I'll just sort of open it up for other feedback people may have to voice. Dennis.
Sorry, I know that we acknowledge it every time a staff member speaks, but I don't think we acknowledge it enough. This is a difficult process. I've sat in on a number of Zoom calls, conference calls, et cetera, and the way staff balances the input is actually very impressive. It's a lot of information. It's always interesting to me how outsiders pose opinions on something when they don't participate in the process. And it's critical that we participate in the process because it's an acknowledgement of the hard work that the staff is doing. And I'm sure all of the members here would appreciate just that type of acknowledgement because it is a difficult process, but it's the right way of approaching this. There's no easy way. There's no silver bullet. There's hard work. And I just, since you gave me a little time here, I appreciate the staff.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I know we all couldn't agree more. And thank you for saying that. This is a complex process by any account. This particular moment within that process necessitates, taking in a wide amount of information, assessing these points of feedback into different categories. And now, obviously, we need to figure out what to do about it. And I think the fact that we're pushing information out as well as taking it in at the same time, I would say teams that have been working on this for years at this moment have, the biggest workload on their shoulders at the moment. So I would share that thanks and bolster your point of sincere thanks for our teams.
Yeah, I want to echo that as well. I think the staff have done a superb job of going through the feedback we've provided, and I thank you all for that. I also want to say that, the calls we had with the staff to go through the material were quite helpful. But I also want to reassure the general public that, we are doing that in a transparent way. So I thank the co-chairs for agreeing to make those calls available. I think that's really important. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And for the general public, they are available. So you can see what we said, and you can see that the staff has in fact done a good job of interpreting that. Thank you.
Online, are we okay with our virtual attendees? Any feedback, Paul or Ann?
Good. I'm good.
I'm good. I wanted to say here to the comments from Dennis and Bob, just right on point, and thanks to all the staff.
Peter?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's been extremely helpful. And just Bob's point about posting the conversations online from the smaller work group sessions is a level of transparency that I think is hopefully helpful for the broader public. Just to clarify, are we going to cover any of the other chapters today? Ag and forestry, land use, local government, are we not running through any of those issues today? I mean, I think the general public is under the belief that we were maybe touching on other issues, but.
So certainly at this moment, if you had particular points of feedback on any of the chapters, it's wide open to provide it. We had wanted to guide the discussion with some of those topics that we kicked off with, but happy to take this chapter by chapter if you think that's the best way to organize ourselves now. But certainly that's what this window of time is meant to do. Donna?
Mine's more of a question. So I think what you said at the beginning, so I was trying to keep up. So please correct me if I'm wrong, is that you were going to try to cover the things where we needed to have the discussion, areas of maybe less agreement or just needing some clarification. And so a lot of the other feedback that we provided is being contemplated, and that's what's in the appendix. Is that fair? So we shouldn't should we repeat all those things, or just if they're there, we're good? Because you're considering.
Well, certainly. So Sarah, maybe I'll ask you to speak to the appendix that has been provided and what we worked to incorporate through the provision of it. And then we can talk about discussions we may have around that content.
Thanks, Doreen. Yes, so the appendix of this deck has the other two categories of feedback that I believe Doreen mentioned at the beginning. So we have those two categories were more what we call editorial feedback that was very straightforward and what we consider non-controversial amongst the members. Clarify what you mean by this, kind of those types of edits. And so we have those captured in the appendix, as well as another category, which is maybe they're not items that would require a full discussion amongst the council, but I think that there were some clarifications that we thought would be helpful between staff and council members on that to make sure they better understood kind of what we were attempting to do, and then kind of, we could make adjustments from there. So both of those sets of feedback are in the appendix of this deck. And so I would say we've already captured that feedback and we're intending on following up on that. So I would say that you shouldn't feel that you need to re-raise those items, but if there was anything in that feedback that you feel you wanted to raise for, to just make the point here publicly or for discussion, you should feel free to.
Thank you. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Mario.
Thank you, Doreen. Just two quick, one on just on the general topic, summary feedback. Again, it was great work, including everything in a very short period of time from staff. Wanted to be clear that when we spoke to labor standards being applied, that it should be applied to all work and for all workers. And in terms of displacement assistance, that should be noted this for all displaced workers, whether it's a bridge to pensions, job guarantees, retention of those who are eventually going to lose their jobs and the incentives they're going to need to continue working until we actually transition, and that those two pieces should be in each chapter. I just wanted to take a moment on that. And just in the just transition piece, everything looks great. It speaks to the application of Buy New York, but I know that the other recommendations were for Buy New York and Buy American. Just wanted to be clear, excuse me, on that. Thank you, Doreen.
Thank you. Donna? No? So to Peter's point, I suppose, just if we could quickly page through this appendix, just for the good of the order. Sarah, I would ask you just to sort of take us on a quick walk through the appendix that is available to the members and will be available to the public as to the assessment that the team has provided as to which items to sort of put in the category of I'll say, category 2 or 3 topics, according to the feedback we've provided.
Sure, happy to, Doreen. So there are 2 different appendices. The first one is, it has some follow-up materials on efficient electrification cost information that was requested at, I believe it was 2 meetings ago. So we have a slide in there on that. And then if you go to the next section, that's where we have the additional feedback on the actual by topic, and we also have a general slide here. So this was just meant to include some of the general topics. And then if we page through, in no particular order, we have these by chapter. So for transportation, you can see we actually here, we only have editorial feedback remaining. The other items, the clean transportation standard was discussed here as a group. Not sure if we want to actually spend much time on these, but just to kind of page through to start with at least. Then next we have waste. And on the following slide, you'll see that there are several follow-up items related to a couple different topics here: biogas, waste reduction, reuse and recycling, and the circular economy. So those were several items that we wanted to follow up, staff follow up with particular council members. And then if you go to the next slide, we have editorial feedback. Again, this is the category of feedback that we see as largely non-controversial and mostly clarifications. So that's contained there. And then this continues on through local government with the same sort of start, first of all, with follow-up items. And then stepping into the editorial feedback. And so we have that for all the remaining chapters: agriculture and forestry, just transition, land use, and adaptation and resilience. Doreen, let me know.
Yeah.
Would you like me to, do we want to walk through any of these in additional detail? To be completely honest, I thought that we thought the discussions around some of these other, the underlying topics would take a little bit more time. And so we were trying to be as efficient as possible. We might have been a little too efficient.
Well, I'd say at this moment, be interested if there are, responding to Peter's point, if anyone wants to talk about any of these chapters or any of the items, at least at first glance, for which specifically we'd have them in the sort of follow-up item category, be happy to hear you out. I don't know that we need to go sector by sector or chapter by chapter, but certainly interested in any initial feedback you might have, and obviously at the next meeting as well, whether this framework is one that's useful as we talk about the next set of chapters too. So I'm kind of interested in both. Any feedback on these appendices, and is this format useful as we head into our next meeting? Sure, Commissioner Reardon.
It appears the DOL team did not get it. This whole email. So if somebody could just check and make sure that we were on the list, because Jane did not get it, Yvonne did not get it, and I did. I'm not, not that I would have had time to read it all the way through before this meeting, but I just want to make sure we're on it. Thanks.
Certainly. And we can go through chapter by chapter if useful, for certain. And don't worry, we'll get you your slides. Bob.
Yeah, I think the staff did a great job of highlighting where we're most likely to have disagreement and focusing the discussion on that. And most of these other things, in looking through them now quickly, I don't feel a compelling need to discuss. The only thing I'd request is if next time around we could get it a day or two in advance. Because then we could go through in more detail and raise it. It's sort of difficult to do so on the fly. Not a complaint, because I understand it's difficult to do, but that would be helpful. Thank you.
Sarah nodded. I recorded that.
You received them as soon as they were ready. Unfortunately, that was just a couple hours in advance. We'll try to do better.
Tom.
Since you asked for feedback, I think the format is great.
Seconded.
Yeah, I was going to pass a motion that, we applaud the staff here. We all spent a lot of time reading this, thinking about it, thinking at the high levels, but the amount of work that goes into the details, which are incredibly complete and detailed. So I want to join the fan club too.
Okay. Well, Peter has his card up.
Is there anybody we need to check in online, or are they okay?
I'm getting a note if anyone's hand is raised online, but Paul and Ann, feel free to jump in as you see fit. And for now, Peter, anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, so thanks, staff, for the tremendous work in trying to synthesize. I haven't had a chance to plow through the appendix, but I will and try to surface more things. There were a couple things on the just transition piece that I wanted to highlight, and one in ag and forestry and waste, where there was something. I'll use that, the last point, because I thought Maureen captured it really well in the alternative fuel section about harmonizing when we're talking about the use of biofuels and biomass. I really think that the ag and forestry section accurately captured what the working group had recommended and discussed, and I think the waste chapter fell a little bit short of that mark. I think, Commissioner, you're looking at me quizzically, but I think that the ag and forestry chapter really did sort of capture the prioritization of grabbing these waste streams, particularly in the agricultural sector, and using them and prioritizing on-site use. The waste chapter sort of contemplated a space that I don't think the working group recommended. So commend the staff on the ag stuff and maybe redouble efforts on the waste stuff to make sure that that is harmonized and appropriately so. In the just transition chapter and elsewhere, and I think it was in ag and forestry, we moved away from specifically labeling and talking about BIPOC communities, and we kind of genericized it into this term of, pardon me, underserved. And I'm not sure what definition that is and why we moved away from specifically naming communities and leaders within that community and sort of identifying as such, and moved away from that terminology. And I'm not sure if that's answered in the slide deck or not. And then last but not least, it's an issue that I think is kicked around in our work group discussions is, are we going to define green hydrogen? We talk a lot about it a lot, but I'm not sure there's anywhere so far in the chapter of how we define that. And then, then how we as a council, but more importantly, the broader public sort of understands the role that it may or may not play based on its definition. So throw a couple of things out there that were in the working group discussions that I don't know if we want to talk about here or not, but I'd love to. And then before we go, I don't know if you want me to raise it now, but I do have one larger concern about our consultation with the Climate Justice Working Group. I'm happy to raise it here or hold off if we wanted to deal with some of those more granular points I made.
So I do believe, and I was going to ask Sarah specifically, with the discussions that we had over the last week or so with the members, I thought the topic of underserved came up, the terminology, and I thought there had been an approach that was considered to address that feedback.
Yes, so this feedback did come back at the feedback sessions last week, and I don't think we had in that particular session a lot of spare time to kind of answer some of the or respond to some of the feedback in terms of clarifying why we made specific changes. But for the underserved community term in particular, some of the public comments that we got actually were calling to our attention that some of the terms that we use can be offensive. And so some specific comments said the use of the term BIPOC communities was offensive, and the term disadvantaged communities. Obviously, there are some terms like disadvantaged communities that are part of the Climate Act law. And so there's not, I guess I would say there's a little bit less flexibility for us to not use those terms. Really what we were trying to do is be as respectful as possible, and we were trying to remove some of those terms that could be seen as offensive and trying to generalize under the term underserved communities or underserved populations. And I think there were a couple particular locations, Peter, where you pointed this out in the text. And I think in those cases, it may look like, I could see that it could be interpreted as maybe us not intending or trying to broaden the definition of disadvantaged communities. It was in no way meant to do anything like that. And so I think that we can just take a closer look at how we're using that term. But also in a chapter that you will get later this week, the climate justice chapter, we try to have a little bit of a discussion up front about kind of the use of terminology and why we're using it in different locations. So I hope that that will also add a little bit of clarity, but certainly if there's feedback on different terms that we should be using to be as respectful as possible, I mean, that was where we were intending to go.
Thanks, Sarah. That's extremely helpful. I'd love to see if it's not too much work to try to ferret out some of those types of comments that you just referenced there to kind of, understand the commenters and the perspective there a little bit fully.
Absolutely. Yeah. Happy to.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That would be a good follow-up. The question on green hydrogen actually had been something that we discussed in the alt fuels subgroup, and certainly could pull that into the Just Transition Working Group chapter as needed. But Maureen, would you want to weigh in any way on the sort of outcome of the subgroup in that respect?
On the definition of green hydrogen?
Yeah.
As far as I recall, it was hydrogen that was made using renewable electricity. And I believe we've always, considered that to be excess, like surplus renewables, where we're at times where we're producing more renewable electricity than we need at the moment. And it would be then that surplus renewables to make hydrogen.
Thanks. I think that's helpful. There was a little bit of discussion in the beginning of today's session about nuclear energy and possibly playing a role there, but I think the renewable definition's better.
So on this chapter, we certainly can take a look if there's a point of reference needed there. We had a table defining all of these things, so I think we could pull that in. Donna?
Sorry, thank you. I was just going to ask, I recalled the discussion as well, and I thought we'd also talked about the differing carbon intensity of hydrogen depending on how it's produced, and that there would be likely some sort of carbon intensity analyses that would be done that would guide it. I mean, green hydrogen, certainly the way that you're describing, but other forms of hydrogen would have, that maybe many are getting away from use of colors and they're using carbon intensity. I thought we talked about that as well.
We did, yes, because there was, and I forget the reference that it was a federal definition that would then have the accounting rules of the Climate Act layered in terms of coming to that determination.
Yeah, I just want to echo Donna's statement as my recollection as well, that we were going away from the color spectrum of hydrogen towards emission intensity.
Which is the DOE
Right.
approach, yeah. Do you have more feedback? Okay. Just checking. On the topic of the Climate Justice Working Group, maybe we can get into your specific points in that respect, Peter, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks. I appreciate it, Doreen. And I do appreciate, as I raised during the last council meeting, the need for engagement with the Climate Justice Working Group, particularly on economy-wide strategies. And I thought that, it wasn't a public session, so we don't have a recording of it. It's not posted. So for those of you in the public that didn't know, there was a discussion last Thursday where we brought together members of the Climate Justice Working Group in 2 different sessions to solicit their feedback on a chapter that we have not had feedback on it yet. And I was pretty concerned during this discussion that the working group was put in a position where they didn't have materials in advance. They all expressed, well, many of the members in the first session, I should say, expressed frustration of being asked to sort of almost comment on the fly. I think somebody else said that earlier today. Commenting on the fly is really just difficult. And, this is an area where what makes New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act vastly different than what's happening in other states is the intentionality on climate justice and equity. And it's baked into the law. It's baked into sections of the law that require agencies to be running climate screens as well as equity screens. And I just really sort of felt, very acutely my whiteness, my maleness, and being at the council and having access to documents, that privilege that affords me. And we're asking leaders of the climate justice movement to come together and work with us as the law requires to consult. And God, I just felt like we really fell short of the mark last Thursday. We just need to do greater intentionality and outreach. I really hope that we can find a pathway forward to share with them the actual write-up of the Clean Transportation Standard to get their feedback on that. It's really critically important to us as a council to understand their input. Dennis, you're often talking about subject matter experts, and I firmly hear you and believe you and are with you on that one. And here we have the statute requires us to consult with subject matter experts, and I just feel like we have to do better. And I put myself in that part of we. It's not a fault of anybody else, but let's redouble our efforts in the next couple of weeks and have a robust dialogue with the working group on the clean transportation standards and really get their feedback on the economy-wide approach. There's a lot of concerns with the cap and invest model. A lot of concerns of how agencies would implement that model, given Section 7.2 and 7.3 of the climate law. And we really need to work that through before we come to determinations as a council leading into December. So I just, thanks for the opportunity to bring that into space and share with you all as the council, as well as the broader public. I'll drop everything in between now and December 19th to get this piece right. We have to.
Hey, Basil?
Peter, yes, Peter, thank you. I think, first of all, I think we all share those views as well. And the staff have been working really hard to deliver materials as quickly as possible. I think we all can and should do better. There may be a path forward here. Frankly, sharing draft materials with the Climate Justice Working Group in advance of you all seeing it as a council provides, at least a question in our mind as to whether or not we're jumping ahead of this body. Moving forward, given the time we have, there may be a middle ground we can strike, getting materials more in advance to that group and putting them in a better position to see materials. Jared's been working on that with them. Jared, do you have some thoughts to share?
I guess just one.
Your microphone or a microphone.
Yeah, just one thing. And Peter's right that what in the economy-wide discussion, we shared with them the presentation made to the council at a prior meeting, but we didn't send them those slides in advance. And that's something we could have done so they could have, considered it and come better prepared for that meeting. Obviously, there's no draft of the, revised draft of the economy-wide chapter to share with them yet. Then the clean transportation standard did come up. That wasn't what we intended to talk about with them because that's part of the transportation chapter, not the economy-wide chapter. After the meeting, we provided the slides that we provided to the council on the clean transportation standard. So they could see some of the differences from a traditional clean fuel standard, but they didn't have that in advance either. I think what I would like to ask is, the council, to your point about not sharing drafts in advance, now that the council has seen the draft and had an opportunity to discuss the draft of the clean transportation standard in the transportation chapter, as long as there's no objections from the council members, I think we're happy to share that with the Climate Justice Working Group and get their input if that's the path the council would like us to take.
Any thoughts on that?
I have a comment from the internet.
Go ahead, internet.
I don't have a problem with sharing that. I was going to say on a personal level from what Peter said, I totally understand scheduling two different calls to talk about the same thing so that everyone can participate. But in this particular case, the majority of the conversation happened on another one of the calls. On one of the calls and not the other. So personally, I would be happy if there could be another opportunity to discuss it with the group. And I think it would meet the need in the sense that now they have had the materials longer and it could be a more less rushed, informed discussion. Just trying to come up with a suggestion in response to what Peter mentioned.
Gavin, did you have a thought on this point in particular?
Oh, no.
Okay.
I do have a thought, though, on something else.
Okay, why don't we close this out? Peter, do you want to follow up?
Well, just, I would, it doesn't sound like anybody object, and I hope we can share that
Yeah.
markup with them. It was referenced during the meeting, and it's kind of, people were kind of looking at the screen like, what are you referencing and why don't we don't have it? So
I think sounds like we're all in agreement.
thanks.
Yeah, seems reasonable to me.
Gavin.
Commissioner, I've been just thinking about a lot of these conversations. And we just had a 5-minute discussion or a short discussion about how do we define green hydrogen? What it is. I agree with what it said it comes from renewable energy. I'm not trying to be a wise guy when I say this. Well, if we're going to pick and choose, can somebody define to me what fossil gas is?
You know, I mean, we're sitting here deciding what the definition of green hydrogen is. Let's find out what the definition of fossil gas is. What I'm trying, my point is, and it may come across sarcastic, is we're trying to pick and choose winners and losers in this process. And we should not be doing that. So I know there was disagreement around this table. Donna, I think Dennis and I disagreed about the use of fossil gas. If we're going to have a definition, let's have that definition put into this context as well, not just what green hydrogen is. I think it's a fairness issue, and it brings credibility to what we're trying to do here. So that's my comment. Thanks.
Reactions to Gavin? Anything?
Paul has his hand up.
Paul, on the internet.
Yeah, just a comment about fossil gas. When someone uses the term natural gas, everybody knows what you're talking about. Everyone knows what you're talking about. When you use the term fossil gas, not many people know what you're talking about. Even if somewhere in an appendix you give it a definition, I'm just not sure it's helpful to use that term fossil gas at all.
Okay, noted. If there's another suggestion on how we go about this, perhaps we come back to the next meeting, entertain it. Dennis?
Yeah, thanks, Basil. Yeah, I think Paul hit it correctly in terms of this is difficult enough to explain what we're doing, and recreating new words, I think, is not good. Let's use the words that the general population understands. Doesn't change the goals. It just makes it clearer to individuals that are used to these type of words, and then creating a new direction, and then we're explaining what it is, and something that we all already know what it is. So that was my only concern with changing it to from natural gas to fossil, to be honest, is we're just continuing to confuse people when we don't need to.
Okay, points made. Unless there's a specific recommendation moving forward, I think we'll continue moving on. Okay. Doreen, anything else?
The next step is to talk about next steps. And so with that, I think I'll just ask Sarah to talk about our plans schedule for the remainder of the year. And happy to see if there's any questions about the logistics associated with it. Sarah?
Thanks, Doreen. So this slide should be familiar. It's similar to the one that we showed at the last meeting. We will continue with the rolling review cycles by chapter, with the next chapters being distributed to the council members this week. At the next council meeting on November 21st, we will discuss the red lines of the chapters that are circulated between now and then. We will also be holding the small feedback sessions, as you can see at the bottom table, on the chapters that we circulate. Those will be held next week. We will do the same as we've done for the feedback sessions that were last week, in that we will record them and they will be posted to the website. And we'll endeavor to do that in advance of the next council meeting as well, similar to what we did for the feedback sessions last week. The revision 2 will be sent out to the council in advance of the December 5th meeting, and then we'll use that council meeting to discuss any outstanding items. And then that sets us up for coming together on the 19th of December for a final vote on the scoping plan. And just a note to reiterate that the meetings going forward will be extended to 4 hours. You can see the schedule here. And all of them will be located right here in the Empire State Plaza meeting room. We'll be back in this room, meeting room 6 for the following meeting. And so we'll look forward to seeing you there in a couple weeks.
Great. Sarah, thank you. My thanks to all of you for coming in today. Peter, you have something else?
Just a slight observation. When we're talking about meeting rooms and talking with the staff, and this is just my observation, not to put anybody on the spot, but I see a lot of people bundled up. Is it too cold in here? And I know that it's sort of endemic, that those of us who use he, him pronouns prefer rooms to be cooler, but let's be a little bit more inclusive to those who don't and prefer rooms to be something where they don't have to wear a blanket to participate.
Thank you for speaking on behalf of the general public. We will endeavor to look into that. I would caution all to bring layers next time. We will look into it. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you all.
Appreciate
See
all
you
your
soon.
time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. See ya.